This week really was a debate up until relatively recently. Sorry, we didn't publish the topic of the show a little bit earlier, but I had wondered for a while and decided at the end that it is worthwhile to really devote the time to speaking a little bit about the life and times of the unfortunately very recently deceased Rav Ovadiah Yosef. It's a very broad topic, discussing the biography of someone who was so central and so important, and the topic of so much discussion. I have very few political inclinations or proclivities, save for the Libertarian Party. I believe that political involvement is pretty much best reserved for, well, not even reserved for the politicians, because they're really bad at it. So I guess I am not a strong proponent of politics of any kind. But there's a historical perspective that I think is very often missing, and taking things out of context makes them very easy to blow out of proportion, or to misunderstand, or to lack appreciation at the same time. So one of the things that I think pretty much everyone needs to appreciate and realize is that when Ovadiah was born in Baghdad, he came to Israel as a teenager. Life in Israel was very different from what it is today. I can give you a couple of anecdotes and examples from my own family. My grandparents came to Israel from Morocco. They left in 1940. They left in 1948, but they ended up in Israel in 1949 because they had to pass from Morocco to Bab el-Wad in Algeria, from there to Marseille in France, and then they ended up in Israel about, I think, 7 or 8 months later. So my grandmother had 3 children in Morocco, in Sfro, and 4 more children in Israel. When she came to Israel, she had just given birth to one of my aunts, and she had afterwards another child. It was at her 6th child that she went to the hospital in order to deliver, and the nurses were all speaking Yiddish amongst them, and one of the nurses says to the other, "Sechs Kinder," she says to her in English, like 6 kids she has, and she didn't speak that much Yiddish coming from Morocco, so one of the other nurses explained to her. What she said was that she was like marveling at the fact that you have 6 kids. And so the nurses started this whole round of jokes between them. So, oh, it's like a dairy farm in your house, like a tenuba. And another one says, so we're probably going to see you here next year. And she said, Be'ezrat Hashem yitbarach, yeah, I hope to be back. Thank you. Like, Amen, Ken Yehi Ratzon. I hope this will come true. So another one of the nurses had to explain to her that the nurse was making fun of her, that she was joking. In other words, she didn't think that having 6 or 7 kids was a fitting, appropriate idea for a woman living in the 20th century. So examples like this abound. I can give you another one just from people, again, in my family and people that I've interacted with personally. There was a cook in my yeshiva that 2 of my brothers went to in Israel, in BMT, it's now defunct, but it was a yeshiva program for boys coming out of high school from all over the world. It was a fascinating place. Over the course of about 40-something years, it was, I think, 240 or 250 boys actually made Aliyah as a result of the decision to come to Israel for a year after having finished high school. And the goal was that if they come and they study for a year, maybe 2, eventually they'll hopefully stay. So they had a chef there for a very long time. His name was Ma'atuk Cohen. And Ma'atuk came from Jerba, it's a peninsula hanging barely off the coast of Tunisia. And when he came, he said he came in the 50s, very Zionist and very enthused and excited. When he came off the boat, he came off with some of his siblings and some cousins. And so they went to Lishkat HaAbodah, this is the government office of employment, and they happened to be giving out jobs, people who just come from wherever they had come from. So they were expected to announce where they were from. You give your name and your country of origin. So I'd say my name is Ma'atuk Cohen. Everybody jokes a Cohen, so that's a pretty common last name over there. My name is Ma'atuk Cohen. I'm from Tunisia. So, okay, Ma'atuk, here's a broom. Why don't you work in the janitorial department of the hospital? We got another brother who came, okay, so you take a mop and you can clean the kitchen. One of his cousins had brown hair and blue eyes. So they came to him and they said, okay, you're going to work in the office, you can answer phones. And it took them all of 3 days to figure out that he didn't speak all that much Yiddish. Again, he was from Tunisia, it wasn't his first language. So by the time they realized that all he could say was, Bigates, Vesherzich, like a couple of very short phrases, basically said, you're from Tunisia, okay, so why don't you go work in the garden? Here's a hoe and you can start picking things up. This was the unfortunate reality that so many of us forget very, very easily, or some of us maybe were never even aware of, when it comes to the integration into the modern state of Israel. It's unfair to look back at this period in history and pretend these things didn't exist. Likewise, by the way, here's one of my last anecdotes on this topic. I had an aunt who was really an excellent student and was refused a scholarship for a college that was given instead to one of her classmates, happened to have a more European-sounding last name, clearly not based on the merit because her grades were better than hers. So things happened. Unfortunately, it was such that the most of the modern Zionist movement was extremely non-religious. So the founding and creation of the state was extremely non-religious.
Say past tense. You're saying it in past tense.
Right. Well, you know what? I stand by that. Because I think the only real Zionist movement you can speak of today is the religious Zionist movement. I don't know how many people who are avowed, secularists or agnostics or atheists actually believe that firmly today in Zionism. The numbers are certainly shrinking, put it that way. So back in the day, it was really secular Jews from Northern Europe that were Russia, some from Germany, a little bit from France, but mostly Russia and Germany, who had come and begun the building of the state. You had a small aliyah in the very late 1840s, 1850s, a little bit more so before and during the Bolshevik Revolution. And then large numbers of Jews came to a state that was already somewhat formed and shaped. And the unfortunate reality was that, the fortunate reality was that Jews from all four corners of the earth were finally coming together and able to share ideas and interact and appreciate the differences and the similarities, and that's fantastic in the right framework, in the right context. These culture clashes weren't only limited to people who were secular or to people who didn't have an appreciation of, let's say, religious erudition or intellect. So, one example, that's what Rabbi Chaim gave us yesterday at YU. He spoke as a student of Rav Ovadiah Yosef's. He said that it was true even in the Rabbanut, how there was, the deck was kind of stacked. He said that one of the Rabbanim from the Edah Charedit once walked into a yeshiva where Rav Ovadiah was teaching. So he looks at him and he says, you guys teach Gemara here? What is it that you study? What books do you... So he said, Rav Ovadiah picked up a book. He says, here, you see it says Talmud Bavli? Like that's what we study. He's like, what do you mean? It's the same Gemara that you study that we study. Why? Where does the question even come from? Rabbi Yitzchak Goren was a chief rabbi in Israel in the late 1960s. He was famous for a teshuvah that Rav Ovadiah actually himself justified after the 6-Day War. Well, actually during the 6-Day War. So Rav Goren was present in the Rabbanut. He was the Ashkenazi chief rabbi at the time. When Rav Shalom Messas came from Morocco, he was formerly the chief rabbi of Morocco, he came to Israel, and many of the Rabbanim in the Rabbanut thought it appropriate to have him tested before they would give him a job as a Dayan. To administer a test to the chief rabbi of Morocco was unheard of. Rav Goren himself, who was Ashkenazi, to his credit, he was the first one who jumped and said, this is absolutely absurd. He said, there's no way. Well, they were saying, if he's familiar with the Moroccan customs and not so much with the tradition of Ashkenazi, he said, this is just outrageous. You're not going to administer a test to a man who's already old and established and clearly published and well-known as a Talmid Chacham. So the reality was a very difficult one. Baruch Hashem, most of these things have changed by now, and a great degree of credit is due to Rav Ovadiah Yosef. He would crack a lot of jokes. He would speak a lot of anecdotes and things that he had encountered and experienced himself. But at the end of the day, the situation was very difficult in Israel. A lot of the secular Jews made fun of the Sephardim for being traditional, for having customs. Say traditional today, it means many different things. No, then traditional meant keeping Shabbat, eating kosher, putting on tefillin, etc. And he was upset both because, in secular terms, society had gone through such violent changes in such a short period of time. Jews for thousands of years kept the mitzvot and were careful not to transgress averot, and all of a sudden, in no time, in literally no time, it was gone. Once he got up, literally cried, and he said, I can't believe that in the Jewish state, the modern state of Israel, there are more than 1 million children who don't know Shema Yisrael. But it's just like that. You say what you will about modernity and technology and science and all, but you have schools, you have roads, you have infrastructure, you have an army, and you have 1 million kids in this country who don't know Shema Yisrael. He was beside himself, and he repeated this throughout his career. So this is the backdrop, this is the context in which you have to have these discussions. Ovadiah passed away, he was 93, but you have to appreciate what was going on in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that made his position of prominence so important. He made some landmark rulings, landmark halachic decisions on very tough topics. The one I mentioned before in the name of Rav Goren was as follows. I actually have an uncle through marriage. He married my aunt. The first child that my grandmother, Alah Shalom, had in Israel. So this aunt married my uncle, Shimon. His family's of Egyptian descent, originally Spanish. And he had a brother in the Dakar submarine. You may or may not have heard the story of this submarine. It was a submarine that the French, give credit where it's due, refused to allow to pass near French waters. They tried to hold it up, so the Israelis had to get it through in a kind of subversive but very clever way, and they did. And this submarine, unfortunately, they lost contact with the naval base in Israel. Nobody knew what had happened. The assumption is that something must have gone wrong. But there was a terrible question of agunot. What do you do for the guys who were on this, I think it was 60-something or 70-something sailors that were on this submarine, and we totally lost contact with them. What becomes of their wives? If a woman knows that her husband passed away, she's permitted to remarry, even a Kohen. Widow can marry a Kohen. If she doesn't know where he is, though, what basis do we have for permitting her to move on? Effectively, what's she going to do? She potentially might be committing adultery. The marriage can only be dissolved through a get or through death. So Rav Yitzchak Goren, Rav Ovadiah agreed with him on this. He said that they managed, after not such a long time, by the way, they only discovered the submarine itself, I think in the very late 90s or the early 2000s. It took them a really long time to locate it, and I don't remember exactly what the reason was, but they found it intact, but it had sunk. And what they found was the distress signal. There was actually a buoy, a physical buoy back in the day before sophisticated telecommunications. There was a distress buoy that they could release that would emit a certain radio frequency. And this is supposed to be, used obviously in only dire circumstances, only in the worst possible scenarios. So the Gemara doesn't talk about submarines and emergency buoys emitting radio signals. How do you handle such a thing? This was classic. You had many Tishavot about things like this. Soldiers from the Six-Day War in 67, from Yom Kippur in 73. Pilots that were shot down and never recovered. What do you do if the guy was married and his wife is going to be stuck, in theory, forever if they can't find the husband and God knows what happened? Maybe he's alive, maybe amnesia, maybe he's a prisoner of war. So some of the first Piskei Halacha that actually put Rav Ovadiah's teachings on the radar, on the scene, had to do with this. The Gemara says, the second last chapter of Masechet Yevamot, that Chazal, our sages, were very lenient in considering evidence that might indicate that a man had passed away for the purpose of allowing his wife to move on. There's nothing to be gained by forcing. Obviously, 10 Commandments. We're careful about about adultery, but even less than perfect evidence that indicates that something terrible had happened, some kind of an accident or some kind of an attack, that it's very unlikely to survive, would in theory suffice, halachically speaking, for the wife to remarry. The examples given in the Mishnah and the Gemara are, someone, a man, for example, if you heard the man shout, "My name is Shimon ben Levi, and I was just stung by a scorpion or bitten by a snake." So even if we couldn't find the body and the animals had gotten to it before we did, at least we have evidence that indicates that something terrible had happened. If it was a venomous snake or scorpion, chances are he didn't survive the attack. And therefore, based on this, we'd be permitted to allow his wife to remarry. If someone were in a burning building, or a building that had collapsed, even if the body couldn't be recovered, or by the time we had gotten to that level of the rubble, this is 9/11, by the way, right out of the Gemara. There's a woman who lives here on the Upper West Side who lost her husband, and then they never found the remains. And it was based on this that they permitted her to remarry. It's an attack that no one was known to have survived. Certainly after enough time had gone by, it would be highly unlikely that anyone else that were to find under the rubble would be still alive. And it's based on this evidence, I would say, kind of approaching an assumption, an educated assumption. Likelihood of survival of such a thing is practically nil. And Chazal were willing to take the chance. And so these were very hotly contested issues back in the day. What do you mean? Maybe he's alive, maybe he's been captured, maybe we don't know, maybe the sailors were picked up by some other ship, God only knows. And in an attempt to be very lenient and allow these women to remarry and not make them stuck, Aguna in Hebrew literally comes, it's another sailor's term, Ogen. Ogen in Hebrew is an anchor, an iron anchor, which is basically what a ship casts, but you throw overboard in order to get it stuck in the sand or on rocks and prevent the ship from moving too far in the waves when you're not intending to go anywhere. So Aguna is the expression used by Chazal, a woman who is literally anchored, she's stuck, she can't go anywhere. Why? Because we don't know what happened to her husband. So these were some very earth-shattering rulings that Rav Ovadiah made very early in his career. And it turns out that he was right in all of them. I mean, when they did recover bodies or they negotiated with the Arabs for the release of the remains of some of these pilots, it was clear that they had already died. And so he was vindicated. They did eventually find the Dakar, 40 years after, 35, 40 years after it had sunk. And the evidence was borne out as well. So this was also a novelty in the world of halakha. I say a novelty because the fashionable thing to do in halakhic rulings for the past maybe 200, maybe 300 years has been to pile on chumrot, to pile on strictures. It was interesting that we asked for people to submit ideas they had for the next series of shiurim. One of our beloved respondents, asked a kind of direct question as to, can we have a shiur on kashrut? Disambiguation of, what's actually halakha and what's actually just strictures, that Johnny-come-lately customs that seem for some reason or other to become popular and become the standard. This was going on everywhere in halakha. In Shabbat, all these discussions on electricity, what you can and can't use. That was another landmark psak of Rav Ovadiah's, opening the refrigerator on Shabbat. When the refrigerators first came to Israel, Ben Chaim said, he remembers because he was there. So in the late 1960s, it was, I think, in 1960, he said he was learning Rav Ovadiah when the question first came up. And the religious community in Israel was up in arms. Here you have these refrigerators that work on a pretty unsophisticated system. You basically open the door and you're introducing hot air to it, and you're causing the compressor to have to compress more gas in order to cool it down. So maybe every time you open the door, you're basically violating Shabbat by causing the thing to go on. In other words, it's tantamount to having flipped the switch with your hand. And if that's the case, then no one who wants to keep their food cool and safe to consume, remember how it's not so cold in Israel, food goes bad very quickly. This was a big blessing for those who could afford it, because it meant that you can go shopping maybe only once or twice a week, as opposed to every single day having to buy fresh food, fresh fish, fresh meat, fresh chicken, fresh dairy products. They wouldn't last more than 24 hours outside. In some cases, it would last 12 hours outside. So Rav Ovadiah really got up with very broad shoulders and said, no one intends to turn on the refrigerator's compressor when they open the door. It's not something that you have in mind. It's not even something that you benefit from. You're actually wasting electricity, because back then they didn't have these switches that would control whether it would go on and off when the door was open. And he was basically probably the most noted and well-known Talmid Chacham, the first to step up and say, this is permitted. According to my opinion, it's perfectly fine. It's not a big deal. No matter what anyone tells you, don't feel bad or inferior if you rely on this. It's perfectly okay. Had a refrigerator in his own home as well. So this this approach, the attitude, which is actually, believe it or not, the attitude in the Gemara, was that we're not supposed to be making life more difficult for people. We're not supposed to make kosher food any more expensive than it needs to be. Our goal is not to cast away as many people as we can from the realm of those who observe the Torah and the mitzvot. Our goal is to include. Our purpose as Rabbanim should be to make halacha as bearable, as tolerable, as easy, and potentially inexpensive as possible. Obviously, within the confines of halacha, we can't invent things, we can't make them up. But we have plenty of precedent on this topic from the Torah itself. The classic example is right out of the Talmud. The Gemara says, what happens if a house happens to have tzara'at? What happens if you find these spots, certain colors, growing inside a house, in a corner specifically? So we'd have to have a kohen come and take a look at the house. So a kohen would come, and once he makes the determination, he'd step outside the house and say, either the house is okay, everything in it is fine, or the house is tameh. The house is tameh, the house is impure, then they need to destroy it. Houses typically were made of stone back in the day. They would have to destroy it completely, and whatever was in the house would be potentially lost. It would be contaminated because of this tumah. So, what does the Torah tell us? This is black and white psukim. The kohen, before he makes his determination being what actually makes this final, it's the final stamp, condemned, not for resale, as they say in USDA terms. So, before he makes this pronouncement of purity or impurity, if it's going to be in the negative direction, he would tell them to empty everything they can out of the house before making such a determination. Why is this? If this didn't depend on him and the house was already contaminated by tzaraat, so anything in it would be impure, and just throw it out and tough luck, go find a new house. From here, Chazal said, "Mikan shehasa Torah mamonan shel Yisrael." From here you see a crystal clear proof that the Torah is concerned for the money, for the parnasah, for the financial well-being of the Jewish nation. In other words, the purpose of the mitzvot is not to destroy your money, not to waste your money. Use what you can. If not, invalid, no longer kosher, then you have to move on.
Don't you learn the same thing from Yaakov that goes back across the river to pick up what he left over?
Interestingly, not so much. In that case, Chazal said that Yaakov was so concerned for his own money that he put his own money almost before his own physical well-being. That's when he ended up going back and having this struggle with this, etc. So, what did he go back for? He went back for pachim klenim, Chazal said, these little containers. So containers are great. My grandmother, Aleh Shalom, referred to her before. She used to sometimes buy things like jams, jellies, or honey just for the containers. She loved these jars. So she'd actually use it, and then when she was done with it, she'd make her own jam or jelly, which tasted much better, wasn't unnecessarily sweet, etc. And she would keep these things. So she'd actually, there was a jar with like bonus jelly or honey that you could use to sweeten something else. So here, Chazal said, certain people, perhaps even tzaddikim, they are mamonam chaviv alehem megufam. They value their belongings more than their own body, meaning they're willing to work hard, to sacrifice, even to risk life and limb, in order to preserve what it is that they have. Understood in a positive light, what that means is that tzaddikim are very careful about not taking things that don't belong to them. They're very careful about the way they negotiate for things. They're very careful not to squeeze or push people into uncomfortable situations or circumstances. So if you know someone's desperate to sell something and you say, I'll give you $100. Nah, make it $95. You know what? I'll cut myself another discount. This person needs the money. Tzaddikim wouldn't do such a thing. So paying the extra $5, not asking for a discount, sometimes it adds up. And tzaddikim also have this habit of spending time learning Torah and helping people. Doesn't often leave that much time for parnasah. So the little that he has is precious to him. If you're familiar with the story in its, again, entire context, Yaakov had been cheated out of so many things that by the time he did have something that was his, and indisputably so, that he was willing to fight for it. He wasn't going to sit there and have to give up on things or let them go or waste all of his hard-earned money, have to rebuild everything by the time he gets back to Eretz Yisrael. So because he was so careful about only taking from what's permissible to him, these things were a little bit more precious to him than they are to other people. At any rate, Rav Ovadiah Yosef would use this halachic principle. It's right out of the Gemara. And he would say, really, there's no reason for us whatsoever to make halacha so unfeasible, so unbearable, that it costs too much. For a variety of reasons. First of all, because it's not our job as rabbis to take the easy road. Right? The easy thing to do as a rabbi, it's not that I'm especially tempted to do this, but the easy thing to do, someone calls you and asks you, I cooked a pot of pasta the other day, and happened to find some worms in it, or some insects, right? Recent question that came up. So, what's the status of this pasta, and what's the status of my pot? Well, the easiest thing for me to do, without opening any books or trying to do any, rabbinic calisthenics, I can say, throw out the pasta and you want to kasher the pot, etc. Happen to learn halacha, you find this is not necessary. There's no reason for you to do this. You might want to check the pasta, see what else you come up with, but there's no reason for me to take the easy road and say, no, you have to be mahmir, you have to throw it out. Because it means time, it means money, it means headaches, etc. And it's intellectually dishonest. Whether I, in my own house, would want to, cook or serve something that has that I found something wrong with is up to me. But for me, giving someone a halachic response to a halachic question, it's irresponsible of me to say halacha requires you to do this unless it actually does. Similarly, give another couple of really solid examples of this. Rav Ovadiah was asked back in the day about tefillin. So back in the day, tefillin were handmade, and they were made in wooden molds. This is the way it was done for thousands of years. You basically take uncured leather. Even if you had cured it, it was still soft enough to work while it was moist. And you would press it into these molds that would make the boxes and make the shapes, etc. So these things were not, the tolerances on them were not to the micrometer. So the tefillin were square in shape. They just weren't perfectly pointy. You couldn't slice an orange with the edges of the tefillin, and that's not how they're necessarily supposed to be. Certainly not how they were for thousands of years. What happened when they had these new technologies, and they opened these new factories, and they start bragging about, my tefillin, they're measured to the micrometer. If it's just a little bit off, they would have thrown them out and tried another pair in the production. And they're perfectly square and perfectly shaped and perfectly measured and perfectly painted, etc. And this became the fashionable thing to do, which is great. If you have a ton of money, you can buy whatever you want. What happens if I happen to be less fortunate than you? I live in the house across the street. I don't have a yard, I don't have a landscaper, and one of my sons is reaching the age of bar mitzvah. I need to buy a pair of tefillin. So do I have to spend $200, $300, $400, $500 or $1,500, $2,000 in order to keep up with the Mizrahis? Well, if I can't afford it and halacha doesn't require it, we need rabbanim who can stand up and say, you know what, there's no reason you should spend your money on such a thing. Anyone who wants to is maybe embellishing when it's not, investing a little bit more, which is nice sometimes even that's not so nice. And anyone who holds by the tefillin the way they were traditionally made is fulfilling his obligation. There's no argument, there's no fight over this.
But Rabbi, in the case of the pot that you said before, with the pasta and the insect, so let's say, it's not that somebody asked you about that happened to you. So you are a rabbi and that happened to you. And now you have two choices. You can go, the way you said before, just look into the halacha and try to find a way to save it. Or maybe you can say, I don't even want to bother, just throw it away, who cares? Mm-hmm. So in the case, it's just between you and halacha, there is nobody else involved. Now, do we argue that you still, even if one is between you and the pasta, mm-hmm. you still have an obligation to find the right way to deal with it rather than take the shortcut and say, who cares? Okay, because in this case, nobody else is involved, it's just you and halacha.
Here's where the short path becomes a long one, and where the long path becomes the short one. I'll explain. The other angle of this, when it comes to rabbinic responsibility, is the concept of what Chazal referred to as koach dehetira adif. What does it mean? Almost everywhere that you find a machloket, and let's be honest, that's pretty much everywhere. You find a dispute, you find one opinion holds like this, one opinion holds like that. So the Gemara's expression on this is the following. Koach dehetira adif, the power of the permitter, of the more lenient opinion, is preferable. It must be greater than the power of the one who forbids. Why? Because it's easy to forbid. The easiest thing for me to do is to say, no, that child's a mamzer, nobody can marry him or her. No, I don't believe you can eat this. No, I don't believe you should buy that, etc. Buy the more expensive alternative. it would make my life much easier. Even more unfortunately, the problem is compounded by people who don't know, people who are ignorant of halakha, and expect that from a rabbi. If Sabato was to tell us the following joke, it's kind of funny, kind of not so funny, but he would say, a woman calls up the rabbi, she says, Rabbi, what do I do in order to make my laundry line? They used to have such a thing, oh God, I feel like from the 1800s. You ever seen how people, well, Israel still have them sometimes, people hang their laundry on a line, right? Clothes line, they used to call this. I haven't used that word in about 25 years. In camp they had it. So a clothesline, right? You would hang your clothes on a line with a little bit of those wooden pins. You're laughing because you know what it looks like. Okay.
Italy.
Every
We're
apartment,
also 200 years old.
every apartment in Israel.
Yeah, in Israel they're pretty common. My grandmother Shalom had one in her backyard, and she brought it with her from Morocco. So one of her most prized possessions. So she wants to kasher her clothesline for Pesach. So she comes to Rav. Rav says to her, "Look, I've never heard of such a thing. I don't see why you would want to kasher it. There's no need for it. You probably haven't used it for cooking or baking anything. There's no reason to suspect any chametz on it." I said, "Okay, thank you, Rabbi." And she goes and asks another rabbi. Another rabbi catches on to this and says, I'll tell you what you need to do. What you need to do is you need to wash this thing with soap, let it dry for 24 hours, then and only then can you take a pot that hasn't been used for 24 hours, fill it up with water up to the top, boil it, and then put your clothesline into it in order to kasher it. She says, finally I found a rabbi. You know, like, this guy knows what he's talking about. It's a very sad joke, and Kol we cry over things like this, because this just indicates to you, this is really what people expect. People really think that you're an imbecile. They think that you're illiterate. If you come up with something like, no, it's permissible, you can go ahead and eat it. Or there's no reason you have to throw this away, or there's no reason to spend so much money on your lulav, etrog, etc. It's really fine. Like, it's really fine. Yeah, he's reformed. It's like Rabbanut, you know? He probably says that, but he wouldn't do it himself. So when I'm asked a question, many of you have asked me these questions, probably most of you at this point. Okay, so halakha, what do you do in your own house? You know what I do in my own house? I do whatever I want in my own house. I'm not going to tell you what I do in my own house, and I don't need you walking around telling people this is what the rabbi does. If I'm lenient, people will say, oh my God, the rabbi's lenient. If I'm strict, they'll say, oh my God, the rabbi's strict. So what I do in my own house is my own prerogative. What halakha is and what you should do in your own home is something else. Here's the rule, here's the principle, the halachic guideline. This is what I told you is permissible. Go ahead and say it in my name. If you want to be more strict on this, you're being strict. But then you need to be intellectually honest enough to say, you know what I'm doing now, halakha doesn't require this. I would convene my entire family. I've done this before. I would get all the kids together and say, kids, you have to see this. I just found a little worm in my pasta. So I have an entire pot, right? Let's say I put in 2 pounds of pasta. I added water. Everything swelled up a little bit. Still al dente, no offense, Dawi. But there's a bit of bite to the pasta.
I believe you.
You probably don't. That's okay. Don't want to eat it? You don't have to. So I was going through the pasta. As I was, just before I added the sauce, right? I was supposed to add the sauce first, but we'll pretend. Just as I'm adding the sauce, I happened to notice an insect fell into my pot. So if this insect lost a wing or a leg in the process, or I managed to pull one off and then I lost the rest of the thing, it's halachically permissible. This is halakha. If it were an entire creature, it would be forbidden for me to eat. But if I happen to take off even just a wing or a leg or something, I don't know if I got the rest of it, I am well within my rights to go ahead and eat from this. Not a problem. I can sell it, I can enjoy it, I can do whatever I want with it because it's halachically permissible. If for whatever reason I chose, maybe because my wife is not so into the concept, whatever reason I chose to dispose of the pasta, I'd be doing it as nothing but a humrah. I would run the potential risk of bar tashchit, of actually wasting something that's halachically permissible. I'll give another example of that in a second. And I may, in theory, lose more than I gain by trying to be strict. Because, Yanas, you have to be honest, there is no such thing as a humrah that doesn't entail some kind of kula. There's no such thing as being strict without being lenient. You may not appreciate this, but anytime you want to be strict on something, that means that you're reducing, limiting, excluding, raising the halachic bar, so to speak, but you're doing it at the expense of something else. Best case scenario, it's only money. It's your money, you can throw it wherever you want, I don't care. I'm pained because there are people who need it more than you, apparently. But it's your money, it's your choice, you do what you want. When you want to be strict on something else, I'll give you a classic rabbinic example. Halachot of Taharat HaMishpacha, halachot of family purity. this tends to involve consequences that go beyond just yes or no. Sometimes it can be shlom bayit, sometimes it can cause other problems, complications. Tefillin are more expensive, not everybody can afford them. Sometimes you're creating an incentive for people to cheat. This is what happened, if you're familiar with this, because I quoted Rav Ovadiah left and right when I hear these stories. The guy that got caught in Muncie selling non-kosher chickens, you may have heard about this. It was a disaster. They got this guy. He wasn't just selling non-kosher chickens. He was selling, he was buying them from the cheapest of cheap places, but he was selling them as if he had a hashgacha that was the best of the best of the best. So his chickens cost twice as much as your typical standard run-of-the-mill regular kosher chicken. Right? As my grandma would say in Arabic, Allah shalom, it's stolen and yet at retail price. Like, if you're going to steal something, so give me a discount, come on. You want me to get involved in the black market with you? I mean, you have to incentivize it somehow. But to steal it and sell it at retail price, this is infuriating. So the guy was buying these chickens from the non-kosher processor, and he was selling them as if he was the most exclusive hashgacha. And the irony was, people were lining up to buy his chickens, and he couldn't stock enough. His fridge would fill and empty every day. Why? Because this halachic mentality is so pervasive. I'm not doing the right thing. I'm not living at a high level. I'm not really careful about Torah mitzvot unless I'm wasting $8 a pound on my chickens. You know? There's no such thing. In my house, I will never bring a chicken that doesn't cost at least $8 a pound. What have you gained? What have you sacrificed? Have you actually thought of it? Did you even open a book before you consult with someone, maybe before you do this? So when you make things really expensive and the spread gets that much bigger, I hate to tell you that you're basically incentivizing theft and fraud, because by inflating the prices so much with these crazy strictures, these Johnny-come-lately customs that are written nowhere, you're forcing people into a corner. And when people are forced into a corner, they have to make one of two really bad choices. Bad choice number one is, I'm going to have to find the money to do this. Generally, it's people who have not that much discretionary income, that feel, learning, yeshivish family, etc. So you feel kind of the peer pressure to spend the little money that you have on super expensive meat, chicken, etc. So either I'm going to play this game, but that's going to create a financial pinch, so I'm going to take the money from somewhere else. It's okay, my wife doesn't have to wear such nice clothing, whatever, the hole's not that big. The run on the stockings, until it's really knee-high, it's not the end of the world. But you're cutting corners somewhere. See, that's insulting. It's offensive. Like the chicken's more important than you are, is basically what he's telling you. I hope none of you are living through this, because I don't want to pour salt on your wounds, but that's the idea. And if your kids look like a mess, and if the house looks like a mess, then you're cutting a lot of corners. You're putting everyone through financial distress, only because you want to keep up with the Mizrachis. The other choice that I have to make is to back out of the game politely and risk ostracization. I'm going to be excommunicated. If people find out, God forbid, that my chicken is under the hashgacha of something a little bit less expensive, perhaps a little bit less fancy, a place that does more than 5 chickens a day, then it's my reputation. My kids go to certain schools, they're going to talk, and they do. And those are difficult pressures for kids to live up. There's difficult pressures for husbands and wives to deal with. As adults, so much more so as kids. My daughter just came home yesterday. Don't even ask me why. There must have been a girl on their bus or something. She told me, Mrs. So-and-so, they were talking amongst themselves about something. Mrs. So-and-so, it wasn't her, it was her daughter. Her daughter said to me, you know what? You guys want to hear something? My mommy told me that we don't have money, and that we can't afford to buy certain kinds of foods because apparently the mother's going through a divorce. And it's gotten really messy. I said, man, I am so sorry. I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry that it's gotten to the kids. I'm sorry that the kids are talking about it. That's just a disaster. And a child, she hears it. What's she going to do? She's going to keep it to herself. No, kids talk. So it's already come to the point. Like, everyone in the family knows about this. Now everybody in the school knows about this. Do we all really need to go there? No, not really. It's very unfortunate, but these things get out. So I'm between a rock and a hard place. Either I spend a ton of money on things that are way out of my budget, but everyone's doing it, so I have to also. Or I crawl into a little cave and not tell anyone, God forbid, that I'm eating kosher chickens, but they're not the super fancy kind, just like the regular kosher kind, like Moshe Rabbeinu ate. So it's a very tough choice. Rav Ovadiah was the one who really, and he went it alone, stood up in the face of all these strictures and said, listen, 90% of this is not required by halakha. The other 10%, which is made up very recently, there's no reason we should be instituting these things. No one who eats from that which is kosher and acceptable should feel bad. No one should feel that they're left out of the realm of those who observe Torah and mitzvot. Many of the people, specifically in the Sephardi community, didn't have the money to waste on these fancy Johnny-come-lately chumrot. So kosher pair of tzitzit, kosher pair of tefillin was fantastic. Encourage people. It's not the end of the world. It can be done. It's feasible. It's achievable. It's attainable. And this was really his work. It didn't come without a cost. He was excommunicated by more than one rabbi in Israel. Stories that are not so well publicized, but this is true. There's a rabbi in Bnei Brak that wrote a very open chirem on him, that he felt that one of his leniencies in Taharat HaMishpacha was just too far gone, even though he quoted others who thought so too. And he suffered quite a bit at the hands of people who felt this way. So it's not that it was all accolades and applause for him from the very beginning, but this was his mission. Really felt this way. He spoke about it all the time. We need to make halakha as easy to observe as possible. That's our job as a rabbanim. We need to give credit back to the rabbanim who actually drew a line in the sand and said, this is acceptable and that's not. Here's another fascinating story, and I can tell you a lot of these. When he was younger, he used to learn in his home in Baghdad. The family was very poor, and they couldn't afford to buy books. So he went to a lending library where he could get one book for like 2 weeks at a time. So he would take a book and he would learn it cover to cover. He would learn it by heart because his tremendous desire to learn things and to understand them. And his father would see him reading until late at night. So he would say, do me a favor, put the book away, it's time to go to bed. So keep with the bang, I have to honor my parents, what do I do? So he would take this little kerosene lamp and he would light it and he would put the covers over his head so that his father wouldn't see it and be annoyed at him for learning. But he couldn't sleep. He just had to continue reading. He only had, however many days to get this done before he had to take the next book. So the fumes had damaged his eyes, which is why you see him in all these pictures with sunglasses on. It's not a fashion statement. And his eyes were very sensitive to light because of this. As a matter of fact, at one point in his life, he had almost completely lost his eyesight. So he took one of his students with him and he said, come, we're going to Tzfat. It's time for me to pray over this because I can't even read anymore. So the student drove him up to Tzfat. Just one student came with him and he told this story over. And Rav Ovadiah said, take me to the qibr, to the grave of Rabbi Yosef Karo. He said, I want to make a special tefillah, special request. So he said that he stood there over his grave and he started crying. And he said, Rabbi Yosef Karo, I have spent my entire life defending your Piskei Halacha, your halachic rulings. I've spent my entire life maintaining the same line in the sand that you drew. This we do, that we don't. This is acceptable, that's not. I wasn't more strict, I wasn't more lenient. I tried to be as true as possible to halacha and tradition, the way you taught it, and the way you ruled it here in Israel. He lived in Tzfat at the end of his life, last 20 or 30 years or so, and he was the Av Beit Din, tremendously influential in Jewish life in Israel and beyond. And he said that within a few days he had recovered enough of his eyesight to be able to read again. So he actually prayed in the merit of the Shulchan Aruch, saying, I did my best and I fought as hard as I could to keep halacha, basic, simple, and achievable. What's asur is asur, what's mutar is mutar. I didn't try to pull or push one way or the other, and I tried to maintain the same standards. The stories of his memory are absolutely unbelievable. Completely unbelievable. Rabbi Chaim told us a story that he himself was party to. There was a Rav who opened a yeshiva in Tel Aviv. This became, I think this was must have been in the late 60s, the early 70s. So he had previously had some other institution, and he moved. He wanted to open a yeshiva in Tel Aviv in the hope that, they can help influence the surroundings a little bit. And the surroundings, Gan Ra, needed a lot of influence. So he spoke to Rav Ben Chaim, and he said, do me a favor. When I was in Yerushalayim, Rav Ovadiah wrote me a hamlatza. He wrote me a letter of approbation, basically acknowledging, he knew where I had learned, how much I had studied, what I had done, and I feel that this new institution, which is really difficult to get off the ground, I think it'd really benefit from having his letter of approbation on it as well. Just he doesn't, give him the name of the new institution, give him my name. Maybe he remembers, maybe he doesn't. So Ben Chaim said, "Okay, not a problem. I will get it for you. I'm going to see him soon. I'm going to ask him if it's okay." He tried to do the same thing. This was, I think, 8 years later. 8 years since the first letter. So he mentioned the name to Rav, and he said, this Rav so-and-so who learned over here and grew up over there, and his parents did this, and his kids are learning here. He said, "Okay, no problem." So he wrote him a letter, this Ktav Hamlatzah, which he then brought back to Tzad Rav, who saw this and almost passed out. And he said, this letter, word for word, was the exact same letter that he'd written 8 years ago, praising him for the exact same things, giving him the same bracha that he should be matzliach, should be successful in whatever it is that he does. He said he didn't even know how to explain this. Either he just had this incredible memory of every single detail of this guy's life. Even 8 years later, he hadn't even seen him. He said, I know that he studied here, and he went there, and he was proficient in this, and he was noted for that, etc. But he said that there's some other explanation he hadn't arrived at. I'll tell you another story that I heard from a Rav who was close to him at one point when he was a Dayan. That there was a woman. She was the daughter of a prominent Talmid Chacham, and she had married a guy who was also a yeshiva guy, who was learned, etc. And her father understood that the couple was going through some kind of a difficult period. They didn't know what to do. They tried intervention, they tried therapy, but they didn't seem to be getting anywhere. And her father knew that she wasn't happy, and they couldn't put their finger on it. So the couple was asked to come see Rav Ovadiah. So he said, "Sure, absolutely, why not?" They came. He spoke and he said his piece, whatever he thought, when it wasn't working right. And the daughter came, spoke a little bit, told him what she thinks, and moved on. So he told one of his students, he said, he's physically abusive with her. Just so you know. She didn't say it, she didn't even allude to it, she didn't hint to it. You investigate that, you'll see that it's true. And it was. It was. She was embarrassed, she didn't want to tell anybody, didn't want to make mention of it. Someone caught her at the right time, approached the subject with her, and she broke down and said, he's just physically abusive, he's been hitting me, and expecting me not to tell anybody, etc. This is the kind of siyata d'ishmaya, the assistance from above that you get when you really sacrifice your life for Torah. Came to Israel. He was sent to Egypt to serve as a Rav by the time he was 20 years old. He was sent to Egypt. Rabbi Avidan, his father remembers him from Egypt.
Wow.
Remembers him as a young Rav in Egypt. So that story's about him, and he knew one of his shamashim, one of his drivers. So he said that he was in Egypt at a very young age, came back to Israel, was already appointed to the Bidin Gadol, and had made quite a name for himself at that particular time. The Sephardim that he wrote, the Yilkut Yosef, sold more copies than the Mishnah Berurah at this point. It is the single highest-selling halachic work around. There is no other book that has sold more, and it's pretty huge at this point. It's almost 30 volumes. It's become a standard reference. In order to print his first Sfarim, not such a well-known story, his wife, Rabbanit Margalit, she was from a Syrian family. Her father apparently had some money. He was a merchant, and I don't know how exactly shidduch was made, but it took him some time to convince her father that this was going to work out. Why? Because it's not new to the Upper West Side that sometimes certain women or their families have concerns for the husband's ability to provide, and to a certain extent it's a legitimate concern, and to a certain extent it's a very illegitimate concern, but it is what it is. So he didn't have any money, he had nothing to show for himself, just that he learned and that he really enjoyed it. And when he wanted to take his first books to print, to a publisher, they had absolutely no money. He wasn't well known, he wasn't that famous, people that he kept with were not very wealthy. So his wife agreed to sell furniture. She sold the furniture in their house. And they went without furniture for almost a year. Didn't invite people for Shabbat, didn't have anyone over. Just as not to, he didn't want to embarrass her and put her in a situation where they have no furniture in the house. Okay, this wasn't in the 1700s. People did have tables and chairs in Israel. And the two of them had such a tremendous mesirut nefesh, such tremendous sacrifice, self-sacrifice for Torah, that she was willing to do this for him. When she passed away, I know someone who was also close enough to him at the time that he could testify to this. Everyone who knew him attested to the fact that he didn't smile for an entire year. 1 whole calendar year, because he was so pained by the loss that she didn't live to a very old age. But he acknowledged that there were very few women who were capable of doing what she did for learning in general, for Torah, and without her he wouldn't have been able to pull it off. Each and every one of his sons was a Talmid Chacham in his own right. He lost a son, unfortunately, last year, but they all became prolific Talmidei Chachamim. They grew up with a pretty tremendous example of what it means to study, to apply yourself, and to sacrifice yourself for Am Yisrael's own good. A little bit later, in the end of his life, he got more involved in the Shas party. Originally, the Shas party was not, it was to a certain extent a religious party. The overwhelming majority of their voters, up until very recently, though it's still true that it's a small majority, were not religious. They actually surveyed people who were voting for Shas. The majority of them were not religious, didn't keep Shabbat. It wasn't so much, yes, it is a religious party, but it was more perhaps an ethnic party than anything else, because people really felt that my grandmother, Shalom, felt for the first time in her life that someone's kind of taken the Sephardim seriously. For her, this was a big deal, having lived through what she lived through. So, the party was what it was. He had surprisingly very little involvement with it. I think that they amplified and magnified a lot of things that either he didn't or didn't say, or that he did or didn't imply. Rav Ben Chaim said that he had absolutely no taste whatsoever for politics. He asked him halachic questions, he gave halachic answers. People who represent the party and do what they do can speak for themselves. But the goal behind all of this was really to bring Am Yisrael back to its roots and to its traditions, and specifically for the Sephardim, we have to acknowledge the fact that they were not held in very high regard, both in the religious and secular aspects of Israeli society, and it all really began to change with Rav Ovadiah and his rulings. You can say what you say about whatever you want, but we do owe him a certain debt of gratitude. He was pained by the fact that a lot of Sephardi families would send their kids to Ashkenazi institutions. Nothing against Ashkenazi institutions. There are some fantastic and wonderful ones that contributed tremendously to Torah and to Jewish tradition. But his goal from a very young age was to really open up institutions that taught and encouraged Sephardi customs and practices and traditions. He was also a tremendous fan of Hazanut. I remember it was he gave shiurim Motzei Shabbat. That I used to, when I made it somewhere that happened to have a TV with this satellite channel, so sometimes I would listen. So he talked about Hazanut, and so he said that there was an accusation back in the day. The Sephardim had copied a lot of their Hazanut from Arabic composers, and there's a lot of truth to the fact that they borrowed certain tunes. He made the point that the Ashkenazim did the very same things. Every culture, borrowed from tunes and musical scales that were available to it. And so one of the jokes that he cracked, he said, "No, Arabim yimach shel muzika tova." Like, what can you do? The Arabs, yimach shemam, they have good music. So he spoke in defense of took a little bit of flack for that comment, but he spoke in defense of the Chazanim using popular tunes that did not have especially religious underpinnings, and applying them to the Kodesh. There were those who wanted to say that if a tune was not composed by an observant Jew, then it was best left for secular music. And he said, no, it's possible that we borrow something. Two of the biggest composers in the Arabic world of music, the world of Arabic music back in the day, were Kulthum and Farid al-Atrash. They were both Egyptian, and they composed prolifically. It's rumored, I heard this from someone who claims that Rav Ovadiah's driver said such a thing, that he used to take inspiration from some of these compositions. Farid al-Atrash didn't do as much singing as he did composing, so a lot of what he did was instrumental. But that Rav Ovadiah himself would listen to music, he found it uplifting, it put him in the right mind frame to focus and concentrate on his limud, and that he stopped listening to Kulthum's music when
he saw her face.
Someone showed him a picture of an album cover. Yeah.
What?
Someone showed him a picture of an album cover. In other words, as long as he didn't know what she looked like, he said, okay, it's interesting music, it's nice depth, and her ability to solo, to improvise was really unique.
Why did that change?
So, the recording aside, she wasn't an especially attractive woman. Let's be honest.
Disgusted?
But,
He got disgusted.
No. It was just, I think it was more for Polisha, that he didn't want to associate, the voice with the face. And
Isn't that going up
Keep his
above and
thoughts.
beyond?
yes,
Because
Not
it's
to
got to
say
be
that
live
it's-
music. The singer has to be.
correct. The fact that it's recorded already, generally speaking,
So isn't he
would
doing
mean that it's not.
exactly what he said you shouldn't do?
This is between him and himself.
No.
This wasn't a loud, open, public kind of thing. Just he asked his driver not to put it on anymore after, he saw what one of the covers of the album. He didn't know what she looked like. But he was just careful about, keeping his thoughts in the right place and not associating anything.
But she wasn't attractive, is that right?
She was not. Decisively
So
so.
wouldn't his,
She's very popular
wouldn't
in
his thoughts
Egypt.
be in the right place because she wasn't attractive? I'm not getting this.
I don't know. I did see a picture of her once, and I found her so horrid that I think, if anything, she would scare me into the fear of God. But I guess I don't know. Can't speak to that. At any rate, it was another feature of his work where he was trying to say, no, just because we grew up in Arabic speaking Muslim countries doesn't mean that the culture and the traditions should be considered anything less than they are elsewhere. I don't think it's that much pride to say that music, language, accent, etc. came from Europe, at least not more so than from Muslim countries. At the end of the day, we all had our joys and challenges coming from our respective countries, but it's a tremendous loss for Am Yisrael. It really is. You can't compare anyone else alive today to Rav Ovadiah, and that leaves us in a very difficult position. What's going to happen inevitably is what happens when someone of such stature passes away, is that factions tend to form. You're going to have people who will say, he would have told us to do this, he would have told us to do that, if he was asked about this, if he was asked about that, if only the question was asked the right way, etc. So everyone's going to claim that they know better than everyone else what it was that he would say or do in a given situation. It's difficult to keep anyone, let alone people with strong opinions, under the same umbrella. But the especially painful thing is that Rav Ovadiah probably was the very, very last, like the last man standing, of the Chachamim who grew up in Chutz La'aretz and who received the Torah as it was passed on for thousands of years before the advent of the modern state. It's not to say that the modern state is a bad thing or necessarily by definition a good thing. Obviously, it's much more good than bad, and there are some unfortunate things about it. But we do view this as the beginning of our hopefully the beginning of our redemption. But there's a concept in archaeology, kind of fascinating, that whenever you find an artifact, especially if it's legible in the case of something being written or engraved or printed, or if you find some kind of work of art and there's still something left to the color and the contrast on it, the safest place to leave it is where you found it. You can take mummified remains or fossils or different things out of the environment in which they were, regardless of where they were before they ended up there, where they got stuck. The fact that they were preserved, generally speaking, where you find them, if already they've been preserved up until now, chances are they'll continue to last that way. Once you move things and you uproot them, you have different factors like temperature changes, humidity, pH, depending on what's in the air, and they're subject to much faster degradation. They learned this the hard way in archaeology, that they had found some fascinating manuscripts and works of art. They didn't preserve them right, so they lasted for thousands of years, and they got destroyed when we pulled them out of the ground or out of some cave or a jar, and then all of a sudden, the ambient conditions changed. Use this as a bit of an analogy for Torah, where tradition was intact in a place like Iraq already from the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. The Babylonian exile is basically where we went after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. We ended up in what was at the time the Babylonian Empire, later overrun by the Persians. The story of Esther, Mordechai, Haman happens in the 70th year of this exile, which we were told was going to be 7 years ahead of time, 70. And maybe 20% of the Jews left this exile back for the rebuilding of the second Beit HaMikdash, but you always had a Jewish presence there. So the community in Iraq was actually there. We're going back now maybe 2,400 years. And those who had the zechut, the merit of learning from the same the same Chachamim who learned from one or two generations before them, this was an unbroken chain. There was never a period of enlightenment or of, abandonment of the Torah and the mitzvot in this community. And the bridge between life before the state of Israel and life after it is now at this point effectively gone. We don't have anyone alive today who can remember what it was like in the old country when the community was intact and when the customs and traditions were intact, which doesn't exist anymore. We have, 2,000 and change Jews left in all of Morocco, maybe 500 families left in Jerba and Tunisia. In Iraq, it's probably less than a minyan. I know it for a fact it's less than a minyan at this point. And there are no other communities that are producing Talmidei Chachamim outside of Israel. I mean, America doesn't have that much tradition to speak of. So, if nothing else, you can appreciate the fact that anyone who steps in to fill these giant shoes today would be coming from a completely different world. Not just the accent itself, but not having grown up with that background, not being able to appreciate, what culture used to be and what it's like today. You take certain things for granted. You just assume, here's how I grew up. Things were always like that. And the appreciation of, history, of the trajectory of Am Yisrael and how halacha has changed over the past 200 years, the perspective is getting more and more skewed the further away we step from it. So it's one thing that I personally find very painful, that I always did love when I was younger. Now that I'm 80 years old, I always liked spending time with people who grew up in Chutz La'aretz, asking how it was. People who grew up in Iraq, in Tunisia, in Libya, in Morocco, Yemen. I was always fascinated by Ashkenazim too, right? Huh? Italy, naturally, was on the top of the list. So I always enjoyed hearing these stories of what it was like in Chutz La'aretz, how they baked matzot in Chutz La'aretz, how they wrote tefillin and mezuzot, the different customs and traditions that they had, and that's effectively gone. That was probably the last Rav that we had who could recall such things, who could tell you how things looked in Chutz La'aretz, how they used to be done, how they were done for thousands of years. So what Moshe Rabbeinu's tefillin probably looked like, how they used to write, the Iraqi writing, you should know, was different from what we write in Sefer Torah today. And Rav Ovadiah grew up with it and remembered it. And these letters have all changed to accommodate all kinds of chumrot, these strictures about how the dalet is supposed to look, how the ayin is supposed to look, how the chet is supposed to look.
What about the Sefer we have at Shul now?
Yeah, it's written with all the modern chumrot that you want. Not the Iraqi one, no.
The Iraqi one.
Correct. We have in the Bet Knesset on loan from, and I'll mention it to his credit, Alber Nagar, an Egyptian Jew whom I also believe was of Iraqi descent, like Rav Alan's his grandfather from Iraq. So we have on loan from Alber Nagar a sefer that was saved from Iraq in it was 150 or 160 years ago it was written, and they smuggled it out. If you look at this sefer, you'll get a classic example of what I'm saying. The dalit, for example, is just a right angle. It's like half a square. There's no piece sticking out on the top right, which all of us learned in first grade was how you make a dalit in Hebrew. It's not. It's not what the dalit of antiquity look. I can prove this to you from 100 different places. If you look at the spaces between the letters, spaces between the words, they're a lot tighter than they used to be, than they are today. They used to be a lot tighter than they currently are. A couple of other letters that have interesting, notable features to them would be the pei, if it's kaf with a waw upside down, or if it's a kaf with a yod inside. Look for these things. When you're reading from the sefer, you'll appreciate the differences. So today, all this has been effectively wiped out by every sofer trying to be the fanciest and to accommodate and incorporate everyone else's strictures and comments and opinions and desires. You can sell a sefer for as much money as you can, calling it mehudar, all the opinions would hold this as kosher, etc. But that's it. That bridge is unfortunately broken, and we have only to hope that a Rav or perhaps a number of Rabbanim will be able to stand up and continue to defend the traditions the way they were always passed on. Certainly no less legitimate than what's being done today, if anything more so. And we hope that Be'ezrat Hashem, the same strength and the same richness of thought, of study, methods of study should continue to be passed on from generation to generation, just as it was for thousands of years, even outside of the modern state. I mean, no disrespect to the modern state, but what makes the Jewish nation as great as it is not necessarily our modern inventions and recent ideas. It's more drawing from tradition and antiquity, which unfortunately has just become a lot more complicated than it was heretofore.
Was Rav Ovadiah a student of the Ben Ish Chai, or did they not overlap?
Rav Ovadiah was born in 1920 on the non-Jewish calendar. The Ben Ish Chai, by all accounts, was niftar, I think, in 1913 or 1914, maybe 1918, I don't remember.
I think they celebrated the 100 years of his 100th Hafkara like a couple years ago.
Maybe it was, yeah, I think it was 1913. So effectively, he never overlapped with him. He overlapped with some of his students. Rav Kaduri was the last man alive who had met the Ben Ish Chai. Ben Ish Chai gave him a bracha that he should have a long life. He went to him, I think he was 13 when he met him. So what he remembered explicitly from the Ben Ish Chai is that he gave him a bracha. How was it? A 13-year-old kid, you'd think to give him a bracha for a long life. He gave him a bracha that he should stay out of trouble, he shouldn't do anything crazy. So he gave him a bracha, he said, you should have a long life. He cleared 100.
I just read that they don't know exactly how old he was anywhere between 110 and 118.
He was an adult. I mean, he was already middle-aged by the time the modern state was founded. He came already a relatively old man to the state. It wasn't like he came young and he grew up there. So Rav Ovadiah actually had a lot of famous disputes with the Talmidim of the Ben Ish Chai and those who wanted to incorporate more Kabbalistic thought into halacha. Not that there was no precedent for it. The Shulchan Aruch itself does have, no small number of Kabbalistic allusions in it. The Bet Yosef quotes Halachot Tzitzit and Netilat Yadayim. He quotes frequently enough from the Zohar. So Rav Ovadiah's point was that these customs and traditions that are based on the Kabbalistic thought that were very heavily encouraged by the Ben Ish Chai, he said that he was, Rav Yehuda Tzadka was the one who held from this. He said that was reserved for Talmidei Chachamim, for Tzaddikim, for people who were very pious and very righteous and wanted to live life at a different level. That wasn't the way they taught halacha to the public. The Ben Ish Chai did. In all fairness, he did. He taught this way to everyone. He had 3,000 people in his Beit Knesset every Shabbat. And he taught just like he wrote in his book, with the names of Hashem and different kavanot, etc. But Rav Ovadiah's point was that, halacha is one thing, Kabbalah is just another level on top of that. So he did pretty ferociously at times, defend halacha in light of these the more Kabbalistic customs and traditions. Rav Kaduri held differently. Having grown up with the students of Ben Ish Chai, he didn't hold this way. But Mordechai Eliyahu also, who passed away, he was younger than him, he passed away about 3 years ago. So he also was very much in the Ben Ish Chai's tradition, but they were all from Baghdad. It was a very rich community with tremendous Talmidei Chachamim, and their books weren't as widely spread as those from Jews in other countries. Okay.